I'd like to now welcome Professor Rob Gleave to come talk to us. Rob is Professor of Arabic Studies here at the Institute. He also was the chief mover behind our recent, Exeter did very well in the recent ref 2014, and Rob was instrumental in kind of putting our submission together, and Exeter came out very well in that, so we're very grateful for him. He's been at Exeter for a number of years. Too many years. 10 years. Too many years. Doing all sorts of interesting projects, has brought in a number of grants, and he's going to talk to us today about research impact and relevance in the humanities. I don't know if any of you kind of applying for jobs or grants will see the impact and the way that your research kind of connects to the real world is a kind of ever more important category, especially when people are looking at the economic value or the social value of our research. So it's something that's really important for people to think about. So Rob's going to talk a little bit about that.
Well, thank you very much, Tina, and thank you for the chance to talk to you. Yeah, please feel free to interject and interrupt me if there's anything which I say which you want to ask about, because I've only got 3 or 4 slides, so we can flip through those reasonably quickly to give you an idea of why this has become such an important part of any young academic's chances of getting a job these days, particularly in the UK, but increasingly across Europe, and even in North America it's becoming important. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the humanities, but I know that you've got another session with my colleague Jonathan Githens-Mazer, who'll be talking about the social sciences later on this afternoon. But I thought that with Jonathan, I would just run through a little, we agreed that I would sort of run through a little bit of what impact entails, and then look at some of the issues which face people who work in the humanities about getting impact. So, yes, in the UK, I'm talking primarily about the UK now, there has been this drive towards the accountability of public financing. That is, institutions that are paid for by the taxpayer need to demonstrate that they are giving something back to the economy through their work. That is, they have to have a social benefit. And so you find that charities, donors to charities want to know how their money's being spent. And similarly with the BBC, which is paid for by a form of taxation in the UK, has to demonstrate that it benefits society in one way or another. And this is something which Gordon Brown said in 2008. He said, higher education has had an easy ride up to now. It is one of the last sectors to change. That is one of the last sectors to explicitly work out ways in which it can show how it makes a difference to society. And the response to this, partly inspired by the then Labour government, but continued by the coalition government after 2010, was to build in this idea of impact into how academics operate. That is, that it's no longer sufficient for an academic to be based in a university, teach students and do research which is read by 5 people worldwide. It is no longer sufficient for that in order to justify the public funds that are being spent on the institution. What's needed is an extra step to try and bring that research out of academia and try and make it demonstrably useful to society. This is the thinking behind the impact agenda, as it's called. And crucial to this was the 2014 Research Excellence Framework. This was the measure, those of you that come from outside of the UK, this was the measure which the government agencies devised in order to assess the impact, the research quality in every single department, in every single institution in the UK. It was a massive exercise in that every single department had to produce a submission which included, first of all, a maximum of 4 outputs for each researcher in that department, and that made up 65% of the overall grade that you got. A description on environment, which is a description on how many PhDs are graduated from that department, how much research funding that department has successfully attracted, and that made up 15%. And then this thing in the middle, impact, which is what Tina asked me to talk about primarily, which was made up of 20% of the overall assessment. It became a very important part of the overall submission. And every department in the country got a grade. And the grade was made up of a composite of these 3 parts. It used to be the case that it was only the first and the last. That is, that all of the assessment exercise that the government devised, all it measured was what's the quality of the outputs, what's the quality of the books and the articles that your researchers have written over the past 5 years, and how many PhDs and how much research funding have you attracted. In 2014, this new category of impact, which made up 20% of the overall mark, was introduced. And we only knew about it in 2012. So for 2 years, universities had to collect the information that they had about what their researchers were doing to bring their research expertise outside of the academic environment. How were they going to demonstrate that their research actually made a difference outside of in society, rather than just being an interesting thing which a few people might study? And in the UK, nearly any job in the UK which has a research element to it will be looking for people who have some form of contribution to make in the area of impact. It's unavoidable, given the fact that this assessment, which the government do, in which everyone gets a grade, is not just a theoretical mark that everyone's given. Real money is attached to it. That is, the government distributes its money for research in all subject areas on the basis of what grade you get in these areas. So for any department to survive, they need to have researchers in it who are going to be able to contribute to impact. Otherwise, they're going to fall down on 20% of their grade, and that could mean millions of pounds. So it becomes very important from an institutional point of view that each department has people who can produce excellent impact, but also that alongside the stuff that you write, your research outputs, articles and books and things like that, and how the department as a whole does in terms of its research environment, as they call it, which is how do you structure your research? How do you make sure that your department is structured in such a way that your researchers can do the work that they want to do? And how do you invest in the next generation of researchers? So everyone has to do this, not just Middle Eastern studies. All departments in every subject area are subject to the same rules. So impact. How do we? This is something which the research councils of the UK have brought about, and this is their little diagram for it. It's rather wordy, but it gives you an idea of what they think you should be doing as new academics. So you've got your academic impact, and that describes how your work that you do, the books you publish, the articles you write, how does that have an impact within academia? And they've got things like, well, you write an article on some obscure element of the Tao, and we know more now about DAOs than we did before. So the subject knowledge is advanced. We are now considered to be in a better position to say things about DAOs than we were before. So there's worldwide academic advancement, as you know, just the sum contribution of knowledge is greater by the fact that Dionysius writes his books. And that is without doubt true. But there's also innovative methodologies, equipment, techniques, and technologies, and cross-disciplinary approaches. This is something which you can make a contribution to in the discipline. And this is particularly relevant for Middle Eastern studies because Middle Eastern studies is an interdisciplinary field. And so you're coming at it from all sorts of perhaps disciplinary backgrounds, but also trying to create something, we've already had a couple of questions about something which goes beyond a strictly, say, political science discipline or anthropology discipline. And if you move on through these, they talk about enhancing the knowledge economy, by which they mean that your work, which you do and produce, enables other researchers to read it and have ideas. And then they may go ahead and write another book in response to your book. And that enables an economy of knowledge to emerge, an economy of knowledge to emerge, which is the sign of a really healthy academic discipline. And you help with the training of highly skilled researchers, and when you write stuff, you're improving teaching and learning. So we all hope that what we write will be read by people, but we also hope that it will trickle down and change the way in which people are taught in university classrooms. You know, if you do a course now on Islamic material culture, you cannot fail to see the name of Dionysius on the reading list, because the students, because he has contributed to the way in which the subject is taught now in universities across Western Europe and North America mainly, but also outside of those areas. So those are the academic impacts which the research councils identify. But they're not the things which are measured in the Research Excellence Framework by the government of the UK. They are things which are measured when they measure the actual quality of the output itself. They look at how it has made a contribution in these areas, and that goes into the grade for that individual article. The actual impact section is much broader, and you can see that that the research councils identify how your work is going to make a difference. The big question with impact is, what has changed because you've written this piece of work? That's what you've got to be able to demonstrate. And when you're applying for jobs, making presentation pitches, that's what you've got to be able to demonstrate to the people who might hire you or give you a research grant or accept your proposal. What will change because of you doing this? Not just change in academia, but what will change outside of academia? How will people think differently because you've written this book or this article? How will you, because you've done this research in order to produce this book or this article? So they've got, the research councils identify improving health and well-being, wealth creation, enhancing research capacity, knowledge and skills of public, private and third sector organisations, by which they mean, you know, voluntary organisations, changing organisational culture and practices, attracting research and development investment, enhancing cultural enrichment and quality of life, evidence-based policy making and influence public process. Now, when we look at what Middle Eastern Studies academics submitted to the last Research Excellence Framework exercise in 2014, you will see that a lot of the submissions were based around informing public policy. That is, that individual academics have had contact with people who make policy decisions in government departments, have advised them, and the way in which they pursued a policy has changed because of that. And with regard to the Middle East, the most obvious examples of this is in political developments. So political scientists within Middle Eastern studies have advised government ministers over how to engage with the Middle East. The government ministers have not always listened to the academics, as political events often demonstrate. But the crucial thing is, have you changed the way in which those operators view their work within the Middle East? Have you changed the way in which they view it? Have you informed them? Are they able to make better informed decisions by doing this? And if they haven't, then what could you do in order to ensure that they do have better information such that they can produce better informed decisions? So those are the sorts of things which you're looking at with impact. But it's not limited purely to the political area, and Jonathan will talk a little bit more about that in terms of social science, because he's been working quite a lot with government departments, and many Middle Eastern studies researchers do the same, work a lot with government departments in order to try and inform, particularly in Britain and in the EU, policy on a national and on a regional level. So, for Middle Eastern Studies academics, there's a number of ways in which you can engage with non-academic bodies. And these are the sorts of suspects that you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about the potential of your research to be taken outside of a university environment. For arts and humanities, perhaps the most influential areas are on this side of the half. I mean, we're talking about the media, working with the media, non-governmental organisations, community organisations, voluntary organisations and charities. So for most people who work in the arts and humanities and culture and leisure services and schools and colleges, most of the work is in this area of this diagram, which is used by people planning impact activities. So you've got to think about what external organisation could you link up with in order to make your research more accessible to people outside of academia. And the real challenge is to do that without actually losing the integrity of the research, without dumbing down, but by trying to make it more accessible. And the most influential work in the last ref was in a whole range of things. So, under the media, there were 5 or 6 different case studies from humanities academics who had worked with specific media organisations in order to improve the quality of their output on Middle Eastern studies. And humanities, people working art and architecture, people who are working in literature, were very engaged with media organisations in order to do that, and they made them into case studies and submitted them to the Research Excellence Framework. And they demonstrated how their impact had been made. So I'm not allowed to give you any specific details about any of the grades which any of them got, but you can look on the REF website and try and work out, because it's supposed to be an anonymous process. But I can tell you what the influential mechanisms were from humanities researchers in Middle Eastern studies when they were working with the media. It was through enabling journalists to recognise that there was a story in examining a particular piece of medieval literature, that it had things to say in the modern period about the nature of the human condition, which would be able to be translatable and could be of interest to the general public. Or preservation of heritage. That is, working with media organisations in order to ensure that Middle Eastern archaeological heritage is not lost and that the media can be an extremely important partner in preserving knowledge from within the region. And the most impressive case studies which used that were able to demonstrate that working with the media, they were able to save or preserve this practice, or enable this community to be better known internationally, particularly when that community is under threat. Religious minority communities and ethnic minority communities within the Middle East. They were able to work with the media in order to bring that to public attention. Schools and colleges and lifelong learning. This was an area where we had a number of case studies in the Research Excellence Framework of academics teaming up with schools in order to ensure that, for example, Arab culture was incorporated into the general studies curriculum of school children from the ages of 12 up until the ages of 18. So that to enable the academic, usually giving their services for free, to be able to go into schools and introduce elements of Arab culture, particularly cuisine, to students in a way that was exciting and interesting, and they got and they made a difference, because those children who may never have had any exposure at all to Arab culture, and the only thing that they would think about when they heard about the Arab world was purely through a news feed, were able to see an entirely different part of element of Middle Eastern culture through a program that an academic had devised with local schools, which was not in an area of ethnic diversity, was in an area of a mono-ethnic area, primarily, in which there was very little cultural diversity, so these kids would not have exposure to cultures other than traditional English culture. And the ability to do that was really impressive, and it will make a huge difference to cultural awareness of those children in the next generation. And academics that contributed to the program could see the difference that they were making. Another example, public art. In that academics, even those who don't work in art and architecture, recognize that public art was a mechanism for community engagement. That is, if an academic works with an artist to create a piece of public art, that will cause a certain amount of public engagement. You get the requisite permissions from the local council, and you manage to, or the people that you're working with who own a property within a public space, and you put on a piece of public work in which you demonstrate the culture that you're studying. A particular example of this was a series of statues that were created by an Arab artist working in conjunction with a academic in a Middle Eastern Studies department, positioned around in a town, making up a sort of trail for people to go around, rather like this fashion these days for elephants or monkeys or whatever. You've seen them around towns and they have them all different colours. They created a trail of statues and models of buildings from the Arab world around a town, which created a public interest and a public engagement with the region in an area of Britain which would never have normally been able to engage with that. It makes a huge difference to the cultural awareness of the population. And then there are community organisations and societies. Perhaps amongst the most impressive examples of this from humanities researchers was engagement with diaspora communities within Europe. That is, that an academic who traditionally studied medieval Arabic literature, and all of their outputs were in medieval Arabic literature, in order to demonstrate that they thought their work could go outside of the academic environment, teamed up with community organisations who were attempting to provide services for diaspora communities, for Yemeni diaspora communities in Europe, and brought elements of medieval Yemeni literature back into the cultural awareness of those communities because of their diasporic nature. They'd lost contact, if you like, with the classical models of literature, and the community organisations wanted to preserve that identity in the modern period. And so the academic was able to take the research that they were doing and introduce it into the operations of community organisations that were working with the Yemeni diaspora communities in the UK and across Europe. And it was a really effective way of transferring knowledge within an academic environment into the community, and thereby demonstrating research impact. And those sorts of activities, when you get them onto your CV and you get the experience of doing them, will make you a very attractive proposition for an employer, particularly in a UK context. So there are some of the examples of Middle Eastern humanities research, which has been transferred into the more public sector, public realm, through the impact agenda. And if it wasn't for the impact agenda, these sorts of partnerships probably would not have happened. So there's a push factor from government in order to demonstrate that the money they invest in students and PhD students and lecturers and the facilities that we have within universities, the money that the government invests, which is ultimately taxpayers' money, somehow makes a difference outside of a purely academic environment. It somehow makes a difference out in the real world, a tangible difference, a measurable difference. And so the introduction of impact into the research excellence framework means that UK academics, and you're seeing this being rolled out across Europe as well, UK academics have got used now to the idea that you can't just sit in your ivory tower, write your books, write your articles, which only a few people are going to read, and expect that to be enough to just ensure that you get a job at the end of your PhD or the end of your postdoc. It doesn't. You might do it. You might be lucky. For the vast majority of people, they've got to be able to demonstrate not just quality in that area, but also an ability to go outside of the academic world and produce an impact in society. And so you're seeing that the research funding for in a European level increasingly builds into it the idea of public engagement and impact. That is that you don't just get funded to do your research, you will get funded to do your research and to try and make that research relevant. And you don't just get funded to do your in-depth PhD research, but also to translate it in a way that makes the general public able to engage with it. And that way you've actually demonstrated your research impact in a way which can be measured and ultimately funded. So that's a sort of run through about impact and about the ways in which humanities researchers in the last 5-6 years in the UK have been demonstrating that impact and how that was measured. And anyone that's applying for jobs within the UK environment will come up against this. But even if you're not thinking of applying for jobs within a UK environment, you're going to face it in Europe and, to an extent, in North America as well, where increasingly public engagement and the contribution of public intellectuals, in inverted commas, is increasingly valued by universities because it's part of how they make themselves connect with their local community. So these are elements of something which will be central to academic life for the next 10 years. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you just say another word about the connection to the political apparatus? You mentioned that, academics advocating in political areas, and if they're not listened to, how do you measure this?
Yeah, well, that is one of the questions which came up when they were trying to devise it. You know, what happens if an academic has had lots of contact and advised lots of people, and the government has just simply ignored what their advice has been?
Right? Do they sign off that they've heard this?
Yeah, well, they do often write a letter to say, this person, we met this person, they talked, we listened, and that's all we can say. But what academics in that situation have been, in order to, that measures a certain amount of impact. It certainly measures engagement, and it shows that you're respected enough to be asked into to an advice context. But what academics who have not managed to make a demonstrable impact with public bodies have done, what they've done is they've gone to other organisations, voluntary organisations, NGOs, and worked with them and demonstrated how their research has impacted on those groups, sometimes campaigning groups, and demonstrated how their research has impacted on the operations of those groups, and how those groups then act as pressure on the government. And so those groups become better informed and are able to target a particular policy. So as an academic, you've got to be able to say, well, if that door doesn't open for you, how else could I do it? What are the other ways in which I can do it? And one of the ways in which a lot of people have done it is through working with NGOs and third sector organisations, campaigning groups, pressure groups, who can then try and inform, because they may have a more effective way of informing government policy than a single academic working on their own. Yes, please.
And to what extent is this impact factor already really a part of someone's job description? Or is it mostly people on their own initiative that say, oh, I want to start this at this school with how does that work?
I think it varies from institution to institution, but most institutions now include within the description of the post, if it's a lecturer post, for example, with both a teaching and a research responsibility, they will include an element of public engagement and impact activities that you're going to have to demonstrate. So it's already worked into the job description. And if it's not worked into the job description, then when you start working, any institution which is aware of these pressures will have programs in order to encourage academics to engage with and form partnerships with organisations outside of academia. You know, here in Exeter we have lots and lots of small grants which are given to individual academics to try and set up partnerships, which, you know, buys them teaching relief from a particular module in order to set up a partnership with an external organisation. So it's, you know, in the UK, it's now an integral part of any promotion procedure from one stage to another stage. Is an assessment of how much impact you've had outside of academia. Another question.
Yeah, it's back to the impact on policy making. I was wondering, so it's. I get that it's not anymore enough at all to just like try to translate your book like in a conclusion, stuff like in policy terms. You actually need to demonstrate that you're engaged.
Yes.
And then that it has an impact. So.
Yes. It's not, well, put it this way, with the way in which, in the UK, the way in which impact is assessed is through the Research Excellence Framework. And the way in which they've devised the system is that they pick case studies. Okay? Now, in order to make a strong case study, you have to demonstrate that you did this research. Obviously, a policymaker is not going to read your book. Okay? However interesting you may think it is, and your colleagues may think it is, whenever I've dealt with anyone in any government institution, they're never going to read a book. Okay, so you think, okay, well, I'll compress it down to an article, 25 pages. They're never going to read an article of 25 pages. They will read one side of A4. And they will then decide whether they want to ask you in and have a longer conversation with you. So it's not going to be enough to say that my book has policy relevance, but then do nothing about it. You've got to be able to get the research and say, my book has policy relevance, and it's relevant for you, and this is why it's relevant. And you've got to be able to translate it in such a way that the person recognises the significance of what you're doing, what your research is for their work. And the only way to do that is, it's a long-term business of establishing networks and getting yourself known and turning up at events and asking probing questions of the people that matter. And then they think, I'd like to hear more from this person. You've got to invest time in it, because if it's going to be part of what your job is, and if you're going to work in the UK, it's going to be part of what your job is, you're going to have to spend a long time networking, and that's extremely important, because you only will have influence and make things change after you've managed to demonstrate that what you're doing is relevant for them. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
How do you measure, excuse me, how do you measure impact outside of so all of the examples that you've given, they're excellent examples, but they're all examples in a domestic setting. So, right, UK academics working in the UK demonstrating impact within UK society, British society. But what about Middle East studies researchers or academics who have had some kind of impact outside of the UK, perhaps in their communities, well, in the Middle East, being interviewed by newspapers or radio stations in different languages, which basically don't come on the radar of the kind of impact that or the kind of examples that you've given. How can they then demonstrate the relevance? Because I'm guessing that for funding institutions in the UK, the kind of relevance and impact we're looking for is really impact and relevance for British societies and so.
On the last point, no, not exclusively. There were lots of case studies which talked about international impact and international influence, so that's not a problem. It is more difficult to evidence it. So, what we are learning to do slowly is find ways in which you can evidence how what you have said has made a difference outside of a UK environment. I mean, you know, within a UK, perhaps you can ask someone to write a letter, or phone them up and say, can you write a letter, and nag them. And within a UK, and you say, oh, I'll come to your offices, okay, and talk with you, and then perhaps you can write a little report about how you've heard what I've said and it's made a difference. It's easier to do it. It's easier to gain the evidence within the UK. But that's a practical element rather than a theoretical exclusion of international. There's no theoretical exclusion of international influence. Some of the organisations that have worked on the preservation of heritage within the Middle East, some of the individual case studies that worked in that area, they had evidence of having worked with Ministry of Tourism of this or that, or the Ministry of Antiquities in this or that place, and how their work had managed to change policy, influence policy, and those are the sorts of things which you need in order to evidence it. Because for the distribution of research money by the government departments, they need evidence to justify why we're going to give this university this amount of money and that university that amount. So it's got to be evidenced impact. And that is crucial, that when academics are learning now to catalogue how they engage with the outside world, outside of academia, how they influence it, letters, references, Twitter followers, retweets. These are all evidence that you're being listened to. And that you might be, and you make a cumulative case within any individual case study. You make a cumulative case for influence. It's not on one particular letter or one particular line. It's like, I've got this, and I've done this, and this person's written, and I've got this many people who've hit on my website, and I've got this many people who have read my policy document, and so quoted my policy document when they were talking about, you know, this topic. And you build up a cumulative evidence that your research is having impact. And that's the best way of doing it. But we've got to get better at cataloguing it. And if you're engaging with Middle Eastern organisations, you have to find ways of doing it. It's actually quite challenging. It's culturally difficult to say at the end, now can you write me a letter? Because you're often talking with non-bureaucratised societies in the way informal exchanges happen, and they don't write a letter in order to confirm that something has happened. I think Dionysius and I have been in this situation when we've been discussing the impact of our research. You know, people don't sit down and write a letter. We just had we had a conversation and we had a cup of tea and we had a chat, and they said they'd try and do something and thought that what we said was very interesting. But they're not going to write you a letter to say that, but it doesn't mean that your research wasn't having impact. So we've got to get better at cataloguing it and finding ways of cataloguing it, and it's not always easy. I think we should stop.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you very much to Rob. We'll get everyone join me in thanking Rob. For